Hello, cybersecurity computer crimes law class. Welcome to the first online lecture for this module. In this lecture, I'm going to just highlight some of the information, mostly from the Ponemon report that I gave you to read, and discuss some other things about the varieties and risks of cybercrime and the economic exposure of economic cybercrimes. The first thing I wanted to highlight to you from the Ponemon Institute report, and by the way, the Ponemon Institute is one of kind of the leading think tanks on these issues of cybersecurity, and for a number of years now they've published a number of reports about the costs of data breaches and the costs of cybercrime. So one of the things I wanted to highlight is the kinds of attacks in the economic area that we're commonly seeing. And at the very first lecture of the Internet Law and Governance class, you might recall some materials that I gave you to look at on the types of cyber attacks. And this information is from the most recently published Ponemon report. So you can see that the top of the list still includes malware. And as we have discussed, malware is code, computer code, computer programs that are designed to do malicious things on the system where they are installed. So for example, a piece of malware might install something that's called a rootkit, which sits sort of at the very lowest level of your computer system structure. It's very, very hard to detect. That might ping as a beacon back to back to the sender of the malware to let them know that they have a compromised system. That might allow them to do a bunch of things. It might allow them to combine your compromised computer with a lot of others to make botnets, and you see botnets on the list here as well. It might allow them to install a keystroke logger to log the actual, record the actual keystrokes to try and catch a password. It might allow them to intercept data traffic. It might allow them to access your webcam, a whole lot of other things it might do. So you see that's the highest category. Now, one of the reasons in the Ponemon report that malware is the highest category is because it also is connected with other sorts of attacks. So for example, here you see phishing and social engineering. So phishing and social engineering is a kind of attack in which you think you are receiving a communication that is somehow authentic. So for example, from your bank or from your boss at work. And in fact, it is not authentic. It is a communication that is very artfully crafted to appear authentic. But when you click on it, very often what it will do is it'll install some malware on your system. So you can see how these things work together. Web-based attacks here is referring to web applications. So you're visiting a website, there are various applications that are running in the context of that site or in accessing that site. And sometimes the code in those applications is kind of dodgy. There are ways for an intruder to utilize that to scrape credentials, to get passwords, other things like that. Malicious code, again, similarly, is code that is injected into a sort of stream of authentic code in order to gain access to something like a database. So a SQL injection is an injection of code into a database access to try and get access to it. Stolen devices, of course, is just physical devices that are stolen. You can see that still remains a pretty significant category. Denial of service is sort of a flooding of a network with many requests all at once in order to make the network inaccessible. Very often this is something that's done by botnets, because you have a large number of computers that are networked together that are able to kind of flood requests. Those botnets, of course, are very often connected with phishing attacks that install malware, right? So you can see how many of these categories flow together. Malicious insiders is an interesting one, and we will see as we over the next couple of weeks as we talk about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, how the criminal law in the United States is still trying to grapple with this question of what kind of threat is it is if someone within the organization is using credentials that really exceed the level of access that they're supposed to have, or is using valid credentials to exfiltrate data and give that data to someone who's not supposed to have it. What kind of crime is that? Is it a crime? We'll see how that's dealt with. And then ransomware. And one of the things you want to notice here with ransomware that the report, the Ponemon report notes, is the pretty significant increase in ransomware in 2017 as opposed to 2016. And ransomware generally is, again, using some kind of malicious code, often, again, getting in through a phishing attack or some kind of web-based attack. And what will often happen then is that code will allow the attacker to encrypt the data on your system, making it useless to you, making it something you can't access. And then you will get a message from the attacker saying, if you want your data back, you have to pay a ransom. And the attackers are very sophisticated about this. In general, there's sort of a kind of market for ransoms. They know not to charge too much because they actually do want to get paid. And there were a number of high-profile ransomware attacks over the past year, Petya and NotPetya, which I just saw a report today, actually, that seems to confirm connections to the Russian government with some of those attacks. So those are kind of a growing kind of attack. So that's a brief overview of kinds of exposures. Another interesting thing to kind of point out in this report is the frequency of attacks. And the thing I want you to notice here is that that last column that says the successful attacks per company each week. Now, the Ponemon survey is a survey of companies that are participating, and you can see the sample size in absolute terms is relatively small, although they do their kind of statistical validation. But notice here that in the company survey, the average is 2.5 successful attacks each week, and 630 something total attacks each week. So almost every company is going to be attacked, and just about every company that is attacked, some of those attacks will be successful. And we'll come back to that theme. Often in this field, it's become a cliche, but often in the cybersecurity field, we say it's not if you are exposed, it's when. And that just is a truism now. You cannot absolutely prevent cyber attacks, and you cannot absolutely ensure that that an attack will not be successful. In fact, you should assume within an organization that you are being attacked, and at least some of those attacks are successful. And the question then is how to really mitigate the exposure. This graph that I pulled out shows the length of time to resolve an attack, the average length of time to resolve an attack in days. And you can see that for a number of these kinds of attacks, particularly for these code-based attacks and for insiders, it takes about a month and a half on average, a month and a half to 2 months to resolve it. Why is that? It's often hard to detect that you have even been attacked. A lot of times malware can sit on a system, on a network for days, weeks, months, relatively long periods of time before you even really know it's there. And then when you know it's there, to try and figure out where it's coming from, how to mitigate it, how to get rid of it, or if it's an insider, to try and figure out to notice that something has happened and to figure out who is doing it, can often be difficult. And this further complicates the ability to enforce and to deal with the risk. This slide shows the total, from the Ponemon study, the total annual cost of cybercrime by attack type per company in the Ponemon report. Now, there are a number of different methodologies and ways to measure the possible cost to an organization from a given attack. We don't really need to get into the details here. There are ways you can sort of dispute Ponemon's figures, but generally it's thought of kind of a sort of reliable industry report or standard on the cost. So just notice that each of these different types, and this kind of correlates, I think, to the length of time that it takes to resolve. This means not just the actual value of the data that might be exfiltrated, but also investigation costs, mitigation costs, cleanup, all those sorts of things. Here's an executive summary from the Ponemon study. And notice that top figure. So what this is saying is that in the companies in this study, the average annual cost of cybercrime to the company, which includes the value of the data, mitigation, investigation, all those sorts of things, is almost $12 million a year. And these costs are going up. So for any organization of any size, and if you read through the report, you'll see actually that in relative terms, it actually can be more costly for smaller organizations because you kind of have less resources to have policies in place to mitigate this in advance. But in any event, it is a big, significant, increasing cost that is causing some significant drags on the overall economy. So, what can we overall gather from the Ponemon report and from this brief introduction? Threats, economic cyber threats, cybercrime threats come from a variety of directions. Organized crime and nation-state hacking present highly organized operations. One of the things that I find really fascinating and chilling in studying cybercrime, there's obviously a lot of kind of low-level individual cybercrime. When you look at the set of videos that I gave you from the speaker from the U.S. Justice Department on harassment and cyber stalking and things like that, those are usually not high-level organized actors, although as you'll see in one of those videos, sometimes they are. But usually that's kind of an individual bad actor. Economic cybercrime also, can be the individual bad actor, but very often it's connected to sophisticated, organized crime operations. Cyber is the new organized crime in many ways, and it is true what you have seen kind of, I'm sure, in the news, in the general media. A lot of that originates in Russia and in China. Now, a lot of it's in the U.S. as well. It's all enmeshed and connected, but the point is it's international, sophisticated, organized crime that also has connections to nation states like Russia and like China and like North Korea. As we see in the Ponemon data, insider threats also remain significant. If you're dealing with this stuff in practice, you're at a law firm representing companies who are dealing with this, or in-house at a company, on the law side, the compliance side, whatever it is, you're going to have to think with these different hats. This kind of, we're being hit by organized crime, we're being hit by disgruntled or dishonest insiders. How are we going to deal with all of that? The motivations for cybercrime are both financial and strategic. There's a lot of money to be made, as you'll see in some of the materials for this week. There's a lot of money to be made for the criminals to take credentials, credit card information, other things like this, and sell it on the dark web. There are also strategic motivations, because as you move further up that chain from kind of organized crime to the nation state and to the exfiltration of intellectual property even by nation states, it becomes a criminal matter that is also a national security matter. It's another one of those things that makes it fascinating, chilling, and difficult for law and law enforcement. The risk of loss is high, is almost inevitable. But the burden of taking protective measures is also really high. In fact, there is no such thing as perfect security. So, how are you going to incentivize private actors to try and take some self-protection measures? And also, how are you going to think as law enforcement of when do we actually want to step in and try and enforce? And if you want to think of as a legislator, what kind of laws can we write in this economic area that might have some effect? And we're going to talk more about those points when we meet together in class. So with that, I will end this portion of the lecture. Watch the rest of the videos that external videos that I have down for the lectures, and we'll come together and we'll talk about all these things when we meet for our first class next week.